Welcome to the RevOps Lab, a podcast exploring the art and science of revenue operations. To find more episodes and resources on scaling your revenue engine, visit getweflow.com/RevOps. Hello and welcome to another edition of the RevOps Lab podcast. My guest today is Jeremy Lamande. He is a top sales operations voice on LinkedIn and has a lot of diversified experience, I would say, in finance, but also worked at companies like Bitly that I think a lot of you know, Better.com, Homeward, Headway, hugely successful app with more than 30 million downloads. And I think it's just fair to say he's a really experienced operator who is now a fractional revenue operations leader and has helped multiple companies grow to more than 100 million in ARR. Very warm welcome. Great to have you.
Yeah, great to be on the show.
All right, Jeremy, maybe for our listeners, could you briefly introduce yourself in 2 or 3 sentences?
Sure, sounds good. Well, it's nice to meet you all. My name is Jeremy. Been leading revenue operation for the past 15 years. As Philip mentioned, done a lot of like B2B SaaS work. And I think, my experience has been around like really building strong foundation for those companies to really kind of like scale efficiently, which is very difficult, right? The more like sellers you had and the harder it is to kind of keep the same like unit economics, right? So it's been fun to kind of like understand like the differences between kind of like the go-to-market. They all are very different, but just making sure that you set it up the right way for each company and just learning and being an operator, working closely with the leadership team and making sure like we hit our goals. So it's been a fun journey, and recently it's been kind of like more like around advising and coming in on board and kind of like being a fractional leaders, which is something that I've always wanted to do. I feel like when you're in the role for a while, it's like, you go from like moving the needle to keeping the lights on, what I call.
It is.
Here, I feel like I'm kind of like moving the needle every single time I go on a project. And it resonates with me. So it's been a fun transition.
Okay. Yeah. Great. And how did you end up in revenue operations? Sort of like, what is your professional journey? I mentioned that you dabbled in finance for a bit. So curious to hear that part. Yeah.
Yeah, just by luck, honestly. My first job out of college I was very lucky because a connection got me into a great opportunity working for a hedge fund for many years. I worked there for like 6-7 years before I joined Goldman. And, I was the youngest employee working with all partners and building a lot of like the financial models. And so what I was doing a lot of like marketing deck, right? Building the models together, then kind of like selling it, to kind of like the clients, and then thinking about like, how do we onboard those clients after that, right? Like how do we optimize? So in a certain way, I was doing a lot of RevOps at the time because I was doing so many different hats. And then when I joined Goldman, I realized, wow, this is kind of like, they hire you to be an expert in one specific domain. And I got really bored really fast. That's kind of like when I started to do I ran my own company. We raised a little bit of funding. We did this for a bit. And that's kind of like I transitioned from kind of like finance into tech, right?
Okay.
And then from tech, I stumbled into like those like sales operation role. That's kind of like how I got in. And to me, that was very interesting, right? Because if you think about, like sales operation is a lot about, working cross-functionally with a lot of different teams, but being able to show the ROI, which is very difficult, right? But partnering with the leadership team around like, this is why we're doing those things, right? This is why we're focusing not on 10 different initiatives, but maybe we stick with 3, right? This is where the ROI like makes the most sense, right? When you think about a quadrants around like, difficulties of, like putting things together versus kind of like how much you can get out of it. You want to get on the upper right corner. And just, I think kind of like working in finance really helped me to understand like what really drives the business. And every business has different like, top metrics, but be able to kind of like take those top metrics and understand like how it is defined on the go-to-market strategies, right? Help me kind of like ramp up faster and build those relationships, right? To make sure like we were all like aligned. So it was very helpful, and it's still obviously like very helpful to kind of like have this like financial background. So yeah, stumbled into it, loved it, right? Because, you know, a combination of like, you know, and you also want to be a bit of an entrepreneur when you think about sales ops, right? Because you're trying a lot of different things. So I think my background in like, you know, starting my own company, raising funding, like kind of like trying different things always helped me, because it's like you should never be satisfied in sales ops or RevOps, right? There is always more you can do. And it comes with like, what are we not doing? And also being very disciplined around like, not, like I mentioned, like not doing too many things, but like, what else can we do? And if, you know, the bar was there last quarter, can we get higher? Right? Always kind of like having this like growth mindset around like, is there more to squeeze, or are we kind of like capped? And sometimes, you know, this is what I've seen with some companies. They're doing really great on the kind of like opportunity stages. They're like 90% conversion on every stage. You may not need to spend too much time there. Maybe it's like more like top of funnel, like lead to opportunities that there may be more juice to squeeze there. So yeah, I think it was kind of like a combination of like finance, being like an entrepreneur, that I think from a sales ops, rev ops perspective is great qualities, because, you know, you want to partner with the sales leaders, right, and marketing and customer success. But at the same time, a lot of the sales ops and rev ops teams are, what I've seen at least, I don't know your experience, but what I've seen are like more like, you know, task taker. And it's like there's just a lot of things that they're being asked to do, a lot of fires every day. And how do you kind of like remove the tactical and be like more strategic and being able to say no? And I think that's something that I've also like learned throughout my career, right? Not jumping on every single things, because at the end it burned me more than once, right? And so yeah, that's a bit of the background there.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think if you look at LinkedIn, right, like what are some of the hot discussion topics that you hear people talking about, definitely saying no is a big one, right? Learning to say how to say no, how to manage like all the various stakeholders. RevOps, I think also as a role is becoming more strategic in comparison, I think, to how we look at sales operations. So like in the past, so much more like a strategic partner than it was like maybe like 10, 20 years ago when like sales operations like really started to take off. So yeah, I think things are changing, and I think it's good. I think it's good that they are, and there's like this emancipation of revenue operations. And I think our episode today sort of like touches on that, like the strategic part in particular. And so what we talked about in our prep call was to really make this episode about compensation planning, essentially. So how do you define quota? How do you define OTE, OTC? And I think it's a really interesting topic that actually, as part of like RevOps Lab, we haven't touched on at all yet. And I actually also think this is a conversation that is happening too little at the moment on LinkedIn. There's very little talk about comp planning. It's very much, I would say, more in the hands of sales leadership. And so just, you know, to get started with it, Jeremy, like how are you thinking about the topic of comp planning? How did you get in touch with it? Sort of like, what is your overall take on it in general?
Yeah, you know, I think every time you join a new company, you know, obviously like compensation and quota setting is, you know, a big thing, right? And especially in startups, right? Because if you think about the different stages, you know, if you're like a public company, your goals may not change that much, right? Like maybe it's just like once a year quota setting, you get a new comp plan and you sign it, right? But as you go like, you know, like further like down, like, you know, series A or B or even C, like quota can change on you like almost like every month, right? So like, how do you know, it's been a topic where like RevOps gets involved a lot, right? Like, you know, you have to think about a lot of different variables from a kind of like a top down, but also like a bottom up. So yeah, I think it's a great topic, especially given that the environment, right? You got like, when you think about sellers hitting quota these days, right? That's been coming down just in general. This is for both public and private companies, right? I mean, used to be closer to like in the mid 50s, right? Which was actually quite healthy. And now you're closer to like 40% on average, right? And some companies maybe even like further down that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So what does that mean? Is it like we're setting quota too high, right? And it's kind of like, hitting the morale on the sales? I think this is kind of like where it's interesting to take a step back and really, because I've been part of those companies where the sales productivity, and what I mean by that is that if you take their OTE, and let's say someone makes OTE, so on target earnings, which is like a combination of like their salary and commission. Usually for an account executive, a seller, right, it's usually around 50-50, right? So 100,000 in base and 100,000 in commission. So if someone makes around that 200,000, right, the sales productivity based on where you are in the series, right? Series A, B, C, or in public, right? It's anywhere between 3 to 5x, right? So like you should go back and see like, are they generating around like 600 grand in revenue? 600 grand to 1 million revenue is kind of like your ballpark. It's a big ballpark, right? But that's the first place that I look at. Every time I join a new company, it's like, which series are they in? What's the sales productivity? Is it healthy or not healthy? And I think that's kind of like a good start, because they're not hitting quota, okay. But sometimes I look at it and I'm like, whoa, the quota is like 6-7x, or sometimes it's like even higher than this, right? Yep. So maybe we're asking way too much, right? So just like setting up the baseline. So that's kind of like a trend that I've seen. And sometimes, and not on the kind of like on the other side of it, which is like, we're doing great. It could be even from a quarter perspective, we're growing really fast. And then you look at the sales productivity, and you're like, they're like 2.5 to 3x, right? And you're like, whoa, this is not good enough, right? But the thing is, maybe a year before they were at 2x, and now they're at 2.5 to 3x, right? And they think it's really good, right? So just like to kind of like take a step back, provide them with some of the insights and the metrics that we've seen, or that I've seen, right? Helps kind of build the kind of the conversation around like, this is the baseline, this is where we want to be, and kind of like build it from there.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. I mean, I think thinking about like setting quota goals too high, right? I think very often I get the feeling that, okay, somebody in a company, maybe the CFO, maybe the board, together with the CFO and the CEO, they get the idea, okay, this needs to be like sort of like our next revenue goal that we hit in order to achieve whatever, like a new fundraising round or something like this. So based on that, the quota for our reps needs to be this and this. Just curious, like, do you think this is the right approach, or how would you approach the topic of setting quota? Because I mean, in the end, that's then also really defining OTE and the OTE attainment, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think in the perfect world, right, people, like folks, need to think about like both sides, right? Like the top down and the bottom up, right? Like the top down is like, we align with our investors that if we're like, let's say 100 million this year, and we want to jump to like 130 by the end of the year, that's kind of like our like investor goals, or from the board's 130. What does that mean from the sales side, right? Like what is kind of like, usually there's a cushion that you put on top, right, for the sales side. So like, do we do a 10-15% cushion on top of this? That's kind of like the first conversation. So maybe you go from 130 to like be like, our like intro goals, I could have used better numbers, but it's like 145, for the sales team. That's the top down. And then you have to kind of where also RevOps come in and think, is this even feasible, right? Do we have the right number of sellers? Did we add what the ramping is looking like, right? Like how long does it take to ramp and all of that? Does it match with our sales cycle? So there is a lot of like kind of like sales cycles, conversions, healthy pipeline. Does it essentially like roll up to all the sellers that we have, or future hires, right? So I think if you do and you spend the right amount of time and you can actually combine both, then I think you have kind of like the right formula. And there is usually some gaps, right? And then this is kind of like where it gets interesting is like, if there is a gap, then there's good conversation with the CFO. This is kind of like where like CRO, CFO should be talking, right? RevOps give insight to the CRO, CFO, like to really kind of communicating around like the gaps. And maybe it's like, we're missing like headcount, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe like the assumptions that we're making on the new hires are too high. And I've seen that as well, right? Because that's another assumption that people make, especially as you ramp fast, is that you take whatever sellers are doing today in terms of productivity, and you assume that every new hires will have the exact same productivity, which might be true for a while until you hit some sort of like inflation points where it's like it becomes, like too hard, right? Conversions are not that high because you're essentially running a go-to-market strategy where you're starting. So there's a lot of like low-hanging fruits, right? So like productivity is really high and gets better with RevOps coming in, right? Better tech stack, better process, better training. So everything goes there, and then you hit some sort of plateau because now you're not going after the low-hanging fruits. You're going after like tier 2 and tier 3. So thinking about all those things, right, is important. But maybe there's one more piece, I think, around just composition in quota that a lot of people are missing outside of kind of just like the goals. Is like, how do you actually set it up, right? Like, what is your composition design and what is your quota setting? So we've talked a little bit about the quota setting, but compensation design is like, you start first with what is the OTE, so on target earnings for each role, right, across the board. Do you have the right benchmark? And there's plenty of like, like resources available for folks. But there's still like, you'll see like even that first principle that you start with OTE, you could see like two companies having like very different OTE per like AEs, and they're like have the same motion. It's a bit, this is kind of like why it's important, right? That's also why some folks are jumping really fast. It's like, I'm making, 150, this company is making 200 OTE. Yeah. I'm doing the exact same thing. Why am I staying here, right? So like being competitive on the first part, which is kind of like the OTE. The second part is OTE to OTC. So we talked about like on-target commission, right? Again, like what is the benchmark? Like BDR is DR versus AE versus account executive versus account managers on the post-sales. Like what are the ratios? So, like usually it's 70-30 on, like younger reps because they also need the income, right? There is coming out of college. Then you'd be a little bit more aggressive on the sellers, account executives. So it's usually a 50-50. And on the account managers, account directors, it's usually, kind of like 50-50 or 60-40. Sometimes you can see a little bit of difference, but like understanding like the nuance there. And then after you get to this, it's like, what are the variables? And I think that's really important. Like, what are the variables that are going to be tied to my incentives? And this is where I see a lot of errors, a lot of mistakes where people are confused. They can't, sellers for the most part, and that's really interesting. Sellers for the most part can't even calculate the compensation on top of their head, which is really bad. You should directionally know what your comp is going to be by the end of the month or by the end of the quarter. Most sellers won't be able to do it. And the reason for that is because it's too complicated, right? Over time, the sales teams or even the RevOps, to be blamed here, have added more complexity, right? So my advice to a lot of the companies is to keep it very simple. Yes, you can do a spiff once in a while because you features on the product side, you want to really push, see how it fits. No issues with that. But keep the variables max to like 3 variables. Don't get over 3 variables. And then from a weight perspective, you need to at least have 20% weight. If you do it 5-10% weight on one variables, sellers are not going to care about it, right? So like keep the weights at least at 20%, 3 variables max. And then from there, make sure that those variables are tying up to the company's objectives. Because companies' objectives sometimes change, right? Like we've seen a lot of shift, with the 0 interest rate period, grow at all costs, all about new business, right? To potentially be more around like the NRR, right? So NRR combination of like churn and expansion. So how do you incentivize the right variables tied to the company goals, right? So that's really important. And that's not something that has been done really well, right? Because it's usually kind of like, this is what we've been doing, kind of like response, right? So like making sure like as you change those goals, they're really tied to their incentives. So that's kind of on the comp plan. Yeah. Any questions there?
Yeah, it's just exactly. One thing I want to say, Davina, is just the variables. You mentioned like, have like maybe like 3 variables to define. Can you give an example of what kind of variables you're thinking about there?
Yeah, of course. So like, if let's say you're an account executive, right, at a B2B SaaS companies, you could have, 2 variables, right? Maybe it's kind of like a 70% new business and 30% maybe it's expansion, right? And what I mean by expansion is, it's always kind of like this like weird swim lanes between account executive and account managers or customer success, depending on like what the post sales is like the 30% on expansion is around when you convert or like a close one a new business. And for like the first like 6 months to 12 months, there's kind of like this overlap, right? Where you can actually like be responsible for the expansion, right? So that's kind of like an example where 70% is new business, right? Your 80% is new business and 20% is expansion, right? So I think that's kind of like an example where you make it simple enough, right? But then if you kind of double click into what does it mean in terms of my quota, right? What is now my quota, right? So like my quota is, let's say I'm at 200,000 OTE, and let's say the quota is like $1 million. So like 5 times per OTE, which is kind of high. So you might be like Series C or Series D or even close to be public, but you're 1 million. Now, if I know that 80% is coming from new business, it's like, what are kind of my commission rate?
Yeah.
And so my advice there as well is like, keep it simple. You don't necessarily need to do a lot of like, deceleration and acceleration and kind of like make it 0 commission until like, you should hire the right reps. If they're not good enough, like just, that's like, there's another like path for them, right? But keep it simple around, maybe a commission rate that is below the kind of like the 10% when you hit your goals, right? So it can be like slightly discounted, but not that much. You can keep it flat. But then like, what are the acceleration? And I've seen like folks capping it a lot or like deceleration at some point. Again, my advice there, what I've seen that works well is there is essentially like 2 thresholds. Anything above 100%, you get like 1.2x on your commission rate. Anything above 125%, you get 1.2x from the prior thresholds, right? So just like keeping it simple, and I think that's a nice incentive. So like again, when you combine, OTE, making sure you pay folks the right way, the ratios OTE versus OTC, what is the kind of like the quota that they're gonna get paid, what are the variables, and what are the commission rates? It's complicated, but don't over engineer. Like folks should know on top of their head how to calculate. And the last piece I don't mention is if they don't know, a lot of the companies are missing out on the ability to give them even like an Excel or Google sheet, right? Where they could actually like do it on their own. So that's another piece like where I will definitely advise for them to kind of like build something for the reps.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely been at a company where the compensation was like changed a couple of times, which essentially led to sellers leaving the company. So I think, there's a lot in it, right? It's like a way to attract talent. It's a way to get rid of talent. Sometimes it's also on purpose to get rid of talent, right? That also does happen. But of course, like if you are like on a stable trajectory, making drastic changes to the compensation plan for your sellers can actually lead to completely destabilizing your company and your organization. So on that note, I'm curious how you think about how often should a revenue organization actually go through the process of redefining? So when do you know, okay, now is a good time to reconsider actually how compensation should be structured?
Yeah, great call. And what I would say on kind of like folks like leaving, my philosophy is as a seller, your role should get easier over time.
Okay.
Right? You've built your pipeline, the business, the ins and outs, right? It should get easier. And that's how you retain talent, right? And if you keep changing the goals on them, that's when you're like missing out because they are going to leave and they are going to jump to another company. So to go back to your questions around like how often should you reset quota? Again, it depends on where you are in your maturity. So Series A, companies or pre-seeds, right? They are starting new motions from the ground up. So they don't know what great looks like yet. So they may have goals that may change, month over month. And sometimes, I built plans where we had no idea. We know from a sales productivity where we should get, but we don't know what the kind of the inputs to outputs recipe looks like, right? So we can even coach them around like, you need to do X in order to get Y. So maybe at the beginning, it's like
generation, essentially.
Exactly. What are the activities that leads to kind of like generating like revenue? And so sometimes at the beginning, you may even just like have some sort of like just inputs, that for just a month or a month and 2 months, right? To get, but that's very early on, right? That's kind of like an extreme scenario where you just pay them on inputs. You just kind of see like what the kind of the outputs, and over time you can like change it. But generally speaking, I would say like Series A, B, depending also of the kind of like the sales cycle, because it's a long sales cycle. It might be difficult to change the goals too often. But for I would say like for high velocity motion, so SMB, mid market, changing the plan every quarter is something that is pretty normal.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're learning around like sometimes even month over month, if you're early Series A or like even B, I would say like month over month or so you can like learning, you see the pipeline and you can like changing a bit of the goal. Obviously it shouldn't be too drastic, right? Like month over month, if your goal was to, generate like X, you don't go from X to like 1.5X, right? You may go from X to 1.1, 1.2, and sometimes you overshoot. And so you go down by 0.9X, right? That's when you start like learning like the whole motion, the pipeline, and kind of like start forecasting for kind of like the 4 year. So again, like changing plan month over month or quarterly for early stage companies is something that I've experienced quite a bit. As you go into more mature companies and have a longer sales cycles, that's when the plan change either like semi-annual or just once a year. Right, they sign it for the year. That's their comp. It's a stable business. They know exactly how many sellers do they need. They know what the pipeline looks like, and they change it. And they don't really touch it that often.
Yeah, makes sense. And also, I mean, I think it also adds a lot of stress to your people, right? If you're like a stable business, do you really want to do that? How often is it really necessary? So yeah. And what types of data or information? I mean, you mentioned a few things. Do you actually need to engage in that kind of like replanning of the compensation? If like sort of like if I think about it, like pipeline coverage obviously feels relevant. Sort of like the stage conversion rates lead to opportunity conversion, ACV. These are all things that come to mind, or how do you think about it? Am I on the right track here, or should I add a few more KPIs or metrics there?
Yeah. There's always more to add. I think it depends on the trajectory of the business. So for example, like if you are like hiring new folks, that's when the complexity comes in around like, when do we hire them? How do we stack those classes? Should we assume the same kind of like what I talked about earlier around like the same kind of productivity from the prior class, and how long can you sustain this? It's difficult. Sometimes you don't know until you hit that tier 1 to tier 2 accounts, right? When conversions start dipping and you're not getting the same productivity. All macro environments comes in, right? There's not as many leads coming in. And so that's a piece where you didn't necessarily plan for it. So now it's like you don't have enough leads for the entire, sales team, either on the marketing side because it's too expensive, or we cut the budget. Right? Like all of those things are tied together, right? Like, it's been, less resources available, less budget. So how does it impact, like your sellers? If you still have the same number of sellers, sometimes, like you said, like you may need to kind of like make some adjustment on the headcount, but then, the quota doesn't change, right? And that's also why a lot of the time you see kind of like that dip, it's going down. It's, they're essentially, it's not apples to apples. They may keep the same conversion rates, but they just don't have enough pipeline.
Yeah.
So And I think that's something relevant here is that we talked about the composition design with all of the variables that I mentioned earlier. But from a quota settings, we did talk about the goals from like the board side, then at the exec side, and how do we do kind of like the cushion on the sales team. But one of the things that I've seen over and over is that usually the quota is kind of like they think about what was the quota last year, and then they're like, okay, well, if last year was X, this year is going to be 1.1X, right? It's kind of like what they call it, like the last year plus, right? There's not enough that went into the conversation and went into like digging in terms of like what the pipeline, well, how does it look like? Everything that you mentioned around like are the conversions the same? Is the sales cycles the same? Do we have the same number of sellers, right? Like are the things similar? Because again, if they're similar from a year ago, like, and you expect now 1.1x, that's when your overall attainment comes down. I mean, it's not rocket science, but there's obviously like a lot of variables that come in, and I think it really comes down to, you know, RevOps being the kind of the brain of the operation. They know the ins and outs of what's happening in their pipeline, right? And it's for RevOps to be able to communicate that to the CRO, right? That then the CRO can actually have the Chief Revenue Officer can then have a very strong conversation with the CFO around why the goals should be different, right? Because it's usually driven from board to CFO to CRO, right? But there's usually like a lack of pushback on the revenue side around like, hey, we can hit those goals, right? Or like CRO comes to the head of sales and like, this is your goals.
Yeah.
Did the RevOps team did the job and really kind of like explain why this is not attainable, right? And so that's kind of like, you know, one thing that maybe get missed as part of like all of those conversations between the stakeholders.
Yeah, I think it's such a great point and also very important. So, I mean, like if the CRO, if you were a sales leader and you manage like a team of sellers, I know, new business, USA, East Coast, something like that, and like the CRO comes to you and tells you this is a quota, right? As a sales leader, how hard are you going to push back, right? Like
it usually doesn't happen. I haven't seen it happening. When CRO tells the numbers, but it's like, did the CRO have the conversation with RevOps, right?
Yeah.
And the head of sales? Does the CRO has all of the kind of like all of the insights required to make that call? And if that's the case, then it's really kind of like, okay, we know what we're going into, right? Yeah. But it's also like, again, it's also like not fair for all the sellers because again, it's like their role should be getting easier and it's not. And we're seeing through the attainment, right? They're not hitting quota, they're not happy. And what ended up happening is like retaining talent is getting harder and harder. So now, it's like this like vicious circle. So now folks are leaving, moving to another companies, and you see this like happening a lot more often than it's ever happened, right?
Yes.
Where people are moving, and it's like I have to hire someone else, which is also very hard because they're probably not going to get the same productivity as my best sellers that are left.
Yeah, 100%, right? Like, and especially like in this economy, right? Like you really want to make sure that you have these opportunities to upsell, to cross-sell on the existing business, and probably your existing sellers are well equipped for that because they know the product and they know the accounts. One thing I want to double down on also here is just to our listeners. I think this is also, I think if you're not involved right now in the comp planning, this is a good topic to actually just be proactive on. This is not about buying a new tool. This is not about like implementing super complicated processes in your CRM and super operational stuff. This is about like collecting the right data points and then making a case to the CRO with something, very objective. And I think RevOps can have that role of like a very, very objective role because they are themselves often not quota carrying. So, they actually can come in and say like, hey, look, this is our pipeline and we have too much pipeline actually, and we don't have enough sellers, or, we don't have enough like pipeline for the sellers that we're currently, like whatever the conversation is going to be, whatever the numbers are going to tell you. This is such a good topic to be proactive on. And I'm pretty sure your CRO will not be angry at you for taking that topic, but they will thank you for preparing it. So I think it's such an important topic to really at least try to own a part of it from a RevOps perspective.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. RevOps should be unbiased to any of those like analysis. Like, it's like, this is what's happening on the ground, and being able to kind of like, like you said, like being proactive. And the one of the reasons why they're not being proactive, and we've talked about it a little earlier, is that RevOps is kind of like, becoming too tactical, right? It's just like, hey, there is like all of those things happening in the CRM. They just don't have the bandwidth to take a step back, right? And owning some of those things. But it's so important, right? Because if you can actually push back on some of those things when it comes to kind of quota setting and having kind of like all of the right measurement to show like why from the bottom up, it doesn't make sense. The head of sales and marketing, well, thank you for this, right?
Sure.
Because you're doing something that they know in the back of their head that is just not feasible, but you're actually like putting it together and presenting to the CRO and really pushing back with, again, like, they're without being, biased. And I think that's just you're doing it for the business, right?
Yeah.
And you're doing it for the sellers. And if you do this, again, you'll have higher attainment, which is also something, when you think about quota setting, something that I haven't touched on is like, how do you set the right quota? What is a good quota? I think it varies from companies to companies. But what I've seen is that a quota setting with 50% of your reps hitting quota and 80% of your reps hitting at least 80% is a really good benchmark, right?
Yeah.
Because you're retaining folks that are achievers, and it keeps it competitive, right? Anything where you have more sellers hitting quota than 50%, maybe your quota is a little too low.
Yep.
Right. And you may want to increase it. And anything where we're seeing at 40% or 30%, that probably means that your quota is a bit too high based on the performance, right? And then it creates like what we talked about. So like, and like you're right, it's like this. We don't never need to go like very deep around all the measurement and the commission rate, all of these things. But like, what is kind of like your like framework when it comes to the compensation design and the quota setting that you can always go back to, pretty much at any companies and apply it. And that's the reason why it's great when we talk about this thing, because I went from like one company to another company. I can tell you, none of those companies had anywhere close to what I'm talking about, right? They all had their own variation with so many different rules. People, folks don't know how to calculate their comp, like those things like should be super straightforward. And, there's a lot of like help advisors and companies on commissions that are like doing a good job around like kind of showing them like what good looks like. But many companies just like, sales manager started the comp plan and, like you're like 5 years in and, you've added like a ton of complexity. So I think that's a good kind of like taking a good step back from, okay, how do I design it? And what does make sense for the business? Is this aligned with kind of like industry practice? And I think if you can like tie all of this together, you may be on the right path.
Yeah. Okay. I think, Jeremy, that's a great point. Also to end, just for our listeners, I want to mention if you're interested in how OTE looks like for like a huge amount of companies, then definitely check out repvue.com. That's REPVUE.com. We're not affiliated with them at all. But it's super interesting to look at sort of like the attainment of companies like HubSpot, Salesforce. So HubSpot is around a little bit higher than 40%. Salesforce at the moment, a little bit less than 40%. And then there are, I think, some outliers where they have like quota attainment like 70, 80% at the moment. Those are some crazy companies, but it's just a good platform to look at because you see sort of like OTE, but you also see OTE attainment. And this gives you a much better idea of like, not only from a seller perspective, but also from a RevOps perspective, what companies are doing well at the moment and which companies kind of like have a good idea of how to build their sales motion and also for a longer amount of time because RevVue tracks that over the years. So you see which companies are more or less stable and which companies have crazy hiccups. So just a general recommendation to check out revenue.com. Jeremy, one question we always ask our guests on this show is, looking back at your career, what advice would you give your younger self or someone just starting out?
Yeah, one thing that I've had the luxury over the past few months is to have kind of the right headspace, right? To actually like continue to learn what's happening in the B2B SaaS world. Like there's so many like great tools out there that I'm like learning myself. Like how do you like actually do like, prompt engineering? How do you build your own custom GPT? Like things that I never had the chance to do that I really enjoyed, and I think will pay off for you as you think about like the new AI waves, like in knowing how to prompt it well, right? And like tweaking it and becoming more of an engineer, which I always kind of wanted to do and never had the skills, but now I can actually like, use my soft skills and kind of become better at it. And that's kind of what I learned. And so what I would say is like, continue to learn, continue to, like seek advice, like mentorship. I think it will really pay off and kind of like provide you with kind of like an holistic view around like what's out there, like maybe, there might be like a different function or a different role, different company that you might be interested. Maybe it's a mission somewhere. And I think just like being curious and like learning and continue to grow is something that I wish I would have known like 10 years ago, and not getting too stuck into one thing and just like always kind of like learning and going out to like, just like events, conference, like learning, even like, like just online. So yeah, that would be kind of like my tip for folks.
Okay, love it. Yeah. Okay, don't ever assume you know everything, right?
That's usually when it goes down for me.
Yeah. I definitely know some people there, and I've also been guilty myself for sure. For some time, every now and then. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the RevOps Lab podcast. Please consider to like and subscribe our show and give us a 5-star rating on wherever you're listening. If you have feedback or suggestions, let us know at podcast@getweflow.com. We read and reply to every email. Thank you.